Hi everyone. Okay, in this video we're going to be starting to have a look at the suffragettes. So we're going to have a look at a little overview of the suffragettes and then some of their key moments in their campaign, and we'll have a look at whether we thought they were helping the campaign or they were hindering it, so they were actually doing it harm. So suffrage means the right to vote. So suffragettes, they didn't brand themselves suffragettes, the newspapers actually called them the suffragettes. They were formed in 1903 by a woman called Emmeline Pankhurst. Now, before the suffragettes, we had the suffragists. Now, the suffragists were formed in 1897 by a woman called Millicent Fawcett. Now, there were key differences between the suffragists and the suffragettes. So we'll just have a look through them really quickly before we focus in on the suffragettes. So the suffragists were... So let's get that back up. The suffragettes were a group of women who were peaceful. Okay, so the key thing to the suffragettes here, so they had meetings, they went on peaceful marches, they wrote letters, they did petitions, they had posters, okay, but they got absolutely nowhere. All right, now the founder of this the suffragists, Millicent Fawcett, said that they were like, she likened them to a glacier. Now, a glacier, massive piece of ice that moves very, very slowly. We're talking like centimeters a year. And she said, we might be moving slowly, but we're definitely going somewhere we're like a glacier. Now, there's another group of women who weren't satisfied with this, and they're the group we're going to focus on, and they are the suffragettes. Now, they said, our aim here is to get the vote, and the only way to do that is to make disruption. So rather than, they did the meetings, they did the protests as well, but the suffragettes were extremely violent. And in the next video, we'll be having a look at whether we actually think they were terrorists. I'll show you the definition of terrorism and then have a look at some evidence, and then you can decide whether you think that they were terrorists. But they were violent. They did things, they went further, so they chained themselves to railings. So we can draw a parallel with the climate activists today. Have we seen on the news recently the people who were outside the COP26? They were gluing their faces to the road. Wouldn't recommend that. Similar tactics by the suffragettes. They chained themselves to railings, but then they went one step further into violence. They smashed windows regularly in London. They set post boxes on fire. And I mentioned in the previous video about this book, this one here, called Death in 10 Minutes. And this is by a historian called Fern Riddell, and it's been released quite recently. And it's about Kitty Marion, who was an arsonist, which means that she went and set fire to buildings and made bombs, and they went a lot more violent than just setting fire to post boxes. Okay, so if you watch the film Suffragette, or you do have a chance to read that book, I would highly recommend it. It's absolutely brilliant about the suffragettes. They were more militant. Okay, they wanted to make the government take notice, and they thought the only way to do that is to really make ourselves stand out. Now, what you've got to think about the suffragettes, and the reason we might think they hindered the right for women to get the vote, which means damaged it, was because what they were trying to do was to say, look, we have our own opinions, we deserve the right to vote, we are trustworthy, we are sensible, we are able. But the way that they did that was by causing damage, by threatening people, by putting lives at risk. So all of the things they were trying to prove that they were doing it in a way that made them not look like that, if you see what I mean. So they said, look, we're really sensible, but we're going to blow up a post box. We're really trustworthy, but we're going to bomb this building. Do you see what I mean? They were in some ways not helpful to themselves. So we'll just have a look at some of the things that they did, and then we'll decide. Don't be overwhelmed by all the text on here. I'm going to go through it all. So they did They were active between 1903 and 1914, and in a couple of videos time I'm going to talk about why they stopped in 1914, what they were doing. So in 1903, where we're starting, Emmeline Pankhurst founded the Women's Social and Political Union, and that became known as the Suffragettes, and the Suffragettes was a name that was given to them by the press. So they set about persuading a Liberal MP to introduce a women's suffrage bill, but this was rejected by Parliament, but it raised the group's membership. So it got them known, all right? So far, so good. They've asked for something to happen. It's not happened, but more people are now supporting them. So then we go to 1905. So they said deeds, not words. So as we said, the suffragists use words. They were going on marches, they were signing things, they were writing letters. The suffragettes said, no, we need to do things, we need to get noticed. So this led to lots of coverage in newspapers, but a lot of people disagreed with this violence. So they got an audience with the Prime Minister, but they didn't really get anywhere. So that could have been a bit more damaging to them, that because people are starting to disagree with what they're doing. So in 1908, they have a demonstration attended by 250,000 people. So we can see that as positive, because that's a really big audience. It's the largest ever political rally in London. Again, it's in newspapers. However, it's ignored by the Prime Minister. So they turn to smashing windows in Downing Street and tying themselves to railings. So we've got a bit of both in that one, haven't we? We've got a really big number of people attending their march, but then we've also got the start of this quite intense violence. So again, we've got another bill here that they're trying to get passed, but that fails. So the government still think women are incapable of having the vote. So if we go back to these two things here, we might actually be able to see why the government think that, because the suffragettes aren't really demonstrating that they can use the vote responsibly. So 300 suffragettes march on Parliament, where they are met with police brutality, assault and arrest. And this becomes common then throughout the suffrage campaign. We see that the police use violence against them quite often to try and get them to stop. So this becomes known as Black Friday, but the journalists blame the women, but some people do say actually the police were getting a little bit too carried away and they didn't need to be doing that. So in 1911, their violence is becoming more extreme. So this then supported those who said women were unfit to have the vote. So this is where they start to really sort of damage their own chances here. So they continued with their damage to property, and they started bombing, and they left bombs in post offices, cathedrals, train stations, libraries, hotels, prisons, courts, and even on piers. So they do become quite extreme from 1911 because they keep getting ignored. So, you know, what else could they do? This is what you've got to think. If you were alive at that time, would you have joined them? Boys as well, because men were members of the suffragettes, they weren't just women. Okay, so in April 1913, the government introduced something called the Cat and Mouse Act. That's its nickname. And it allows authorities to temporarily release suffragettes on hunger strike and then rearrest them once they've recovered. So what women started to do is when they were arrested for being suffragettes, they went on hunger strike, which means when they went in prison, they starved themselves. And the reason that they did that was because they knew that the government couldn't allow one of them to die, because then it would become really, really big worldwide news, how important this was to women, how far these women had gone. So when these women got really ill, first they would force feed them by forcing a tube down their throat. Absolutely horrific. It would not be allowed today. And then once they had got really unwell from not eating for so long, they would let them go and then they would recapture them. So the suffragettes would recommit a crime, they would arrest them again, put them back in prison, and then every time they got released from prison, the suffragettes would be waiting outside and they would give them a ribbon. So it was like a badge of honour to be arrested and then released. There's loads of fascinating stories about these suffragettes if you have a chance to read them. There's quite a few of them in that book, and also a book called Difficult Women. There's a a chapter on the vote, and it's just absolutely fascinating stories. So the government were forced to pass this bill after widespread criticism for their violent force feeding of the suffragettes. Okay, then we've got June 1913, Emily Davison. So she's an important suffragette member. I would encourage you to Google her and to have a look on YouTube as well. You can actually see the video of what I'm going to tell you about in a second on YouTube. So she threw herself underneath the king's horse and she died. So some people said that she was another foolish woman, but it did bring worldwide public attention to the suffragette cause. So there's debate among historians about whether Emily Davison actually intended to become a martyr, which means somebody who dies for what they believe in, or whether she was actually trying to put the king's a suffrage ribbon around the neck of the king's horse. So it was the king's horse that killed her. He wasn't riding it, it was being ridden by somebody else. The horse was fine, the rider was fine, but she unfortunately died 3 days later in hospital from her injuries. So some people say that she was intending on killing herself to raise awareness. Some people thought that she was trying to get the suffragette ribbon around the horse's neck, because that horse, when it crossed the finish line, would be photographed loads because it was the king's horse. And if it had the suffrage ribbon around it, it would mean that it would show that the king was supporting the suffragettes and therefore get them again a lot more attention. So you can make your own conclusion about that, but that's what happened in 1913. And then in 1914, when World War I broke out, the suffragettes only had 5,000 members, much lower than the suffragists. But what Emmeline Pankhurst said was all women need to support the war effort, and we'll talk more about that in the next video. Okay, so as you can see here, looking at everything, there were a lot of things they did that got them attention, but not necessarily positive attention. And when we go on to look at the women's war effort, you can then decide what you think gave women the vote, whether it was the suffragettes or whether it was World War I. So here, if we just go back to Emily Davison, I'll just, you can pause this and talk through, and read through this in your own time. I'll just make it as big as I can. But if you want to just pause the video at any point, you can have a read through that. But we'll just have a look at the eyewitness account here. So it said the king's horse, Anma, came up and Miss Davidson went towards it. She put out her hand, but whether it was to catch hold of the reins or protect herself, I don't know. It was all over in a few seconds. The horse knocked her over with great force and then stumbled and fell, throwing the jockey violently onto the ground. Both he and Miss Davison were bleeding a lot. I feel sure that, this is his opinion. I feel sure that Miss Davison meant to stop the horse and that she didn't go onto the course accidentally, thinking the race was over. So he thinks that she did it on purpose. That's obviously his opinion. So this is another one. So somebody else, Emmeline Pankhurst, who was the leader of the suffragette movement, she said she threw herself at the king's horse in full view of the king and queen and a great multitude of their Majesty's subjects. So she said to end the intolerable torture of women. So Emmeline Pankhurst thought she did it on purpose. However, in 2013, a documentary re-examining it says Davison intended to throw a suffragette flag around the neck of a horse or attach it to the horse's bridle. So it seems that she was not attempting to throw herself in front of a horse to commit suicide. So there is quite a big disagreement on this subject, and there will always be. That's the way that history works. People look at the evidence and they interpret it in different ways, but that's one of two things. And either way, what the death of Emily Davison did was it brought worldwide attention, because this is what the government were fearing, a suffragette would actually die, and then it would be like, well, look at what this government are doing, look at how these women are fighting. I do want to point out that women around the world didn't necessarily have the vote at this time. Women in America didn't get it until 1920, and some countries women have only got the vote in very, very recent years, like we're talking 2016. So it wasn't like we were the only country in the world where women didn't have the vote, but it did bring a lot of worldwide attention because of what the suffragettes were doing. So the government may have given women the vote. We will never know, because World War I came and interrupted all of that. So in the next video, we'll have a look at World War I and how that impacted the suffragettes movement and actually helped them in a lot of ways. So thanks for tuning into that video, and hopefully I'll see you in the next one about the war effort, and we'll also have a little bit of a look at Kitty marrying as well.